Mark, thank you for joining me just to chat a little bit about the new book.
Yeah.
It's just came in today. It's been great to get to know you and Trudy and the family over the last few years, and really appreciate the friendship and input into our lives. When it comes to this book, you've influenced my thoughts in lots of different ways. But in particular with this book, what I've written in the introduction, and by the way, really chuffed that you've written the foreword, but connecting those two things together, there was a particular moment in 2020 where we were supposed to run our first New Festival. You were going to come, and in person, which would have been wonderful. And then the pandemic came, and the rest is history, so to speak. But what was amazing was we managed to get you online with 150 people or different leaders, and we had a great time with you on that, and lots of wonderful kind of insights around what the Lord was doing, or what we were discerning the Spirit might be doing at that particular time, and you provoked us in a really profound way with a simple sentence, but one that I felt like carried a lot of prophetic pregnancy. And I think the context was that you were reflecting on not just the crisis of the pandemic, but also some of the moral failures that had begun to be exposed in the church at that time. And then you sort of pivoted into a hopeful kind of posture at the same time, that around the world you felt that the Lord was preparing in the hidden place a new whole cohort of leaders who were holy, hungry, and humble, was how you described them.
Yeah.
And that just really marked a lot of us, I think, at that particular time, and stayed with us. Can you take us back to that moment a little bit and tell us what you were sensing there, and what was going on as you said those words?
Well, I think it was in 2019 I began to get a sense that there was a change coming. And it wasn't like, often I get senses through looking at culture and trying to read what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
But it was almost an unexpected spiritual sense. And I was praying actually in New York, and I was at the top of this building praying, and I just felt the Lord. I sort of in my head had my plans that I sort of set out how I would do things and stuff like that. And I just felt the Lord saying this tremendous change is coming, and it didn't feel good. It felt ominous.
Wow.
And that in response to this, he was going to do something different with creating or seeding in the world a new kind of leader, that sort of platforms were being removed, and that a new kind of leader was going to emerge. And but then also attending that was something was going to be really disruptive. And so I didn't know what that was. I didn't, often say I didn't see the pandemic necessarily coming, that obviously. But I think it's not just been the pandemic, it's been a series of multiple things. As you just outlined there's been leaders which have fallen, leaders which, I looked at my bookshelf not that long ago and I was like, oh, wow, that person, that person. And I think also, just a sense though, that also as God's beginning to move in the world, often it's connected. So almost like that was phase one of seeing like sort of a seeding. But I think what we're seeing now is some of that seeding sort of coming into sort of a sprouting. So going back to that, I just felt in the midst of that this is a disruption, but the Lord will use it. And I think that's what we're seeing now. Yeah.
And so maybe just picking up from that last sentence, how do you think things have shifted from 2020? I love that seeding to sprouting, but in some ways it feels like at lots of different levels, everything's accelerated in some ways. But
100%.
how would you describe where we find ourselves now?
Well, I think it was like the world seemed predictable before. And so in a sense, it looked like the world was heading a particular direction. There was particularly sense, I think, in Western countries that the world was heading to a more secular direction. And it was going to be increasingly difficult for the church, that people were less interested in God. I think what we're seeing now is a lot of the promise of the world is now like a broken promise. People are looking for God in ways that is really unexpected. institutions, everything from government to business to celebrities to sporting bodies to everything has been humiliated. And, in many ways, that's created this opening where people are now looking for something beyond. So I think that was sort of like a big thing that's happening in the world. So now you can see like it wasn't just seeding leaders for the sake of seeding leaders to sort of just help us, just sort of be resilient in the midst of an inevitable loss. That actually part of that seeding was also preparing people for what God is doing now, And, there just seems to be a sovereign move of God in the world where there's just this interest out there, and I hear it from people in all different countries. And so, I think that's sort of what's been going on, as I can try and see it. Yeah.
Wow. And when I think about just part of the heart of what I'm trying to bring across in this book, thinking about the countercultural nature of the cruciform way and the way of Jesus. And, it's obviously so countercultural because you find life by giving yours away, the cross at the center of our Christian faith is the most powerful act in history, but also the most loving, self-sacrificial act of history. So it's foolishness of the world in some ways.
Yes.
How do we as leaders square that with what we see, particularly maybe in the geopolitical kind of sphere at the moment of leadership? How should we be affected by that? And maybe how worrying is it sometimes when the church co-opts some of that worldly way of leading?
Yeah. Well, I reckon almost like you had a like there's different models of different leadership at different times, and there's almost like archetypes of what a great leader is. It could be, the explorer or the sort of, war hero, and it was the manager for a while. Like, it was almost like the manager who's able to present well and has a focus group and so on. And that's really fallen over, although there's still parts of the world still trying to run that script. And very much, I think what's happened now, you've got a very bombastic, self-focused kind of leadership, which in an internet environment wants to go viral. So that's through saying shocking things. Also, the world has been changed from a world shaped by institutions, where often you led by being the institutional person and getting to the top by obeying the rules of the institution. Now almost we're post-institutions, you almost get to the top by breaking the rules. And it's more about creating a platform, because we live in a social media platform world, digital platforms. So I think that some of that seeps into the church. There's a sense of impact and influence is equated with the amount of eyeballs on you. And so for young people, many of whom, if you look at a lot of the research around what young people want to do when they're older, they don't want to be an astronaut anymore or, a race car driver. They actually want to be a YouTube celebrity.
Wow.
So, this seeps into the Christian world, so there's a sense that people can feel, and, I hear this from lots of leaders, I'm not having an impact, because the things that we used to say of having an impact of, wow, we're feeding the community in this way, or, we're doing this in our local area, that almost doesn't count in this new world of metrics. So I think that sort of cruciform idea of being a leader, interestingly, though, it seems hidden, but I think it's going to have more cut through because it's so countercultural compared to almost in many ways what we see is sort of almost a toxification of leadership. So as leadership gets more toxic and there's less leaders that people look to where they're inspired by them, I think that that's sort of what you're outlining in the book is going to become sort of a bit more luminous and attractive. Yeah.
Really good. Really good. You've kind of touched on this already, but your own books and work has, as I say, influenced me and many in this particular way. And the latest one, From Platforms to Pillars, in a coming out from a slightly different maybe angle, is really pressing into that same theme, isn't it? Do you want to talk a little bit more just about the kind of thesis at the heart of that?
Yeah. I just realized how the whole world is being disrupted by Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley has an idea of, it's a mantra called move fast and break things. And, you just look at political power in the US when Donald Trump was elected, in the front row, it wasn't Congress people and senators, it was Silicon Valley elite. And it showed you how this journey of the last sort of 30 years from seemingly sort of obscure utopians trying to do stuff in San Francisco to really people who are shaping the global economy now, the global information sphere, and the power is immense. And, so increasingly leaders now are not going to get into power unless they're good wielders of social media.
Oh.
And, I just began to realize how this wasn't just affecting leadership, it was also affecting how ordinary people see their lives, that previously, a 16-year-old would have never thought that they could have massive influence, unless maybe they were a child star. But now 16-year-olds believe that they can have massive influence if they get a platform. So it's like this shortcut to influence. Previously, people who had influence were very brave. You think of a figure like Rosa Parks, became world famous through her step of bravery. But, or they worked their way to the top of an organization. They're a famous general or, a humanitarian, or an incredible artist. There was a skill. It could be a political skill. It could be a humanitarian skill. It could be a craft that made them famous. But that's been disconnected now. It's purely if you can get as many eyeballs on you at a time. So I wanted to write about how that was changing the world, and that inevitably was flowing into what we saw it was to be a human being, that to be a human being is to be placed on a platform, validated by others, seen by others. And that's really warping our idea of leadership and being a disciple of Jesus. So I contrast that with a biblical idea. In Revelation, there's this description where it talks about, us in the coming kingdom of God being pillars in the living temple that he's building in the world. And pillars work together. It's not singular. They have strength, and they are connected heaven to earth, and they create space. This room here, every room has pillars in the wall. Sometimes you can see the pillars, other times you can't, which bear the weight. So the fact that we can have this conversation is because there are pillars operating. So they create space for other things to flourish, other people, but ultimately my argument is for the presence of God. So our role is not to put ourselves on a platform, which is, if you trace the history of platforms back, you get back to altars.
Yes.
It's actually the presence of God. So the other form of pillar too is that when someone who passes away in a community who's really invested and lived in this way for others, they're often described as a pillar of the community. So I'm sort of arguing, don't pursue platform, pursue a life as a pillar. That's the essential thesis.
That's brilliant. Tying into that, so throughout the book, I try to list different characteristics or the kind of chapter headings of a cruciform way, things like surrender and servanthood and team and on it goes. One of the chapters I talked about the testing, a kind of tested apprentice, and how in some ways this is maybe a lost art that or a lost discipline of it seems that everybody biblically that does anything significant and influential that lasts beyond themselves as a leader went through a time of testing. And I like to use the word harnessing. It's almost like that idea of a kind of wild horse that's full of strength, but until it's broken properly, the strength can't be channeled in the right directions, otherwise it could do damage. And have you any more reflections on that? Even I don't even know personally, but I know for me, the times I was being harnessed, I was frustrated with God.
Yes. And
now I look around the world at so many of the failures and failings, and even conscious of them in my own life, and think, by the grace of God, you harnessed me, you allowed that in some ways to go on in my life, or in some ways allowed me to be held back until something could be done in me. And I just feel quite passionate that as much as I want to see a generation equipped and released, that we don't lose that testing kind of phase.
Yeah. There's a great, if you're interested in this as a biblical idea, there's a great podcast. Tim Mackey is my friend who does the Bible Project they did on testing as a biblical theme. And I listened to that podcast and I was like, wow, it is everywhere. It is a constant biblical theme. And you can miss it, but then you realize that it just keeps happening. And I think it's really interesting because we live in a world which is increasingly about harm minimization. It's increasingly about anything that is difficult should be avoided. They call it, there's helicopter parenting.
Yeah.
I like the term they use in Scandinavia, which is curling parenting, that, the game curling, where they brush in front of the ice. So it's making everything smooth, anything difficult. And even too, that flows into discussions around, end of life care. There's like assisted dying. Part of it is people say, I don't want to have any suffering. So from birth now to older life, there's this thing of avoiding suffering, avoiding difficulty. But then in a sense, you're also avoiding testing, And I think back to, I had this really interesting conversation with my wife, Trudy, where we sort of one day we're just talking about, okay, so if we did our sort of ministry life journeys again, how we do it differently. It's like, maybe I would have gone there and done that and gone here. And we're having this big conversation. And then one day, at the end of it, I just went, hang on. The entire thing I just plotted out was my life in a way that would have avoided all the suffering. And I just said we wouldn't be who we are today. And I think so much of the leadership journey, there's books I have read which have impacted me, conferences I've gone to, people I've met, information I've gained, but none of that would be worth anything. It's really God's grown me through difficulty and suffering and challenge. And so I think when we do that, we avoid maturing. And so testing is a form of maturing that is utterly essential for leaders. And if we take that out of our model of leadership and model of training leaders, we're going to create leaders. I should put it this way. I'm not going to say we create leaders who fail. We're failing those we're training if we do that. And you get it. I mean, when your kid falls over and skins their knee, you want to give them a big hug. So there's that sense, and I think God has that feeling for us, 100% of compassion, but He also allows us to go through these seasons of testing. And I'll just add one more thing. It's interesting, like, as I've gotten older, I've noticed that when I was younger and I would go and speak somewhere or whatever, I would want people to go, oh, great talk, what an amazing talk, fantastic book. Because interesting, I was recently somewhere, I was actually in New Zealand, and someone came up to me and they said, I heard you back when you were like in your early 20s or something doing this thing. And he goes, I just wanted to just say it's been so good to see how God's used you over your life. Or I've heard people say to Trudy, my wife, who's gone through a battle with cancer, like how you've lived through this. And I realized like, it's not how well I did the talk. It's how well I'm living in all the seasons of my life. That's ultimately what people are looking for now. We've seen enough talented people.
Yeah.
So talent is worth nothing without the testing. Yeah.
Very good. Very good. If we are experiencing at this particular moment in time the first fruits of a sense of renewal, and much of the data and much of the anecdotal stuff as well that we're hearing seems to be pointing in that direction, and obviously we want to steward that humbly and not get too far the line, but certainly we want to rejoice and celebrate with what we do see God doing. How, if that's the case, how significant is leadership in this next season, and in particular maybe Cruciform type leadership?
100%. So to put it in context, what the question has to be asked: what is happening? And I think the word revival, awakening, outpouring, renewal needs to be put in a historical context. I think what we're seeing is perhaps something really new, I'm starting to wonder, in that most of the revivals that you talk about, there's been revivals here in Northern Ireland. There was a revival in my city in Melbourne. But a lot of it was Christian people who were culturally Christian who then became more alive in their faith. The Hebridean revival was in a very Presbyterian community where the tension in people was we weren't living up to our Presbyterianism. You know what I mean, in a sense. What we're seeing at the moment, and it's global, is an evangelistic opening. So I think we've heard stories of like, what happened at Asbury, or there's been this sort of other sort of outpouring moments. But the far bigger story is there seems to be a huge amount of people in the world who all of a sudden have lost faith in what's happening in the world. And because of the crisis of the world, now are seeking God, and many unexpectedly becoming Christians. So weirdly, I think what we're seeing is less the church being renewed and revived, and then people being drawn to it. It's that a switch has been switched on in the culture where all of a sudden heaps of people are interested, to become Christian. So, recently I heard this, someone shared with me that in Japan, which is a very small percentage of Christians, the church has been good at discipleship because they've been very, persecuted in their history and small church. But there was a survey done recently by Gallup. There's something like they asked Gen Z in Japan, if you're going to become a religion, what would you become? And they gave them all the options. 90% of Japanese young people said they become a Christian. So all of a sudden in Japan, which is traditionally seen as, Christianity as a Western thing, a huge amount of young people are now open. So the question is now, will the Japanese church respond to that? And that's not just the Japanese church question. So my thing I'm starting to realize now is it's less like how it's worked in the past. It's actually the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. And so leadership is really key. And I think, Trudy and I were here in Lisbon a few years ago, and we went into this, I think it's the linen factory thing. And I was a bit bored. Trudy was interested in the Irish linen. And I think it was in that building that there was like a John Wesley bust of his head. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. All of a sudden got interested, and he was preaching there. That awakening went for a couple hundred years because you had leaders like John Wesley who were able then to take the harvest and produce workers through his leadership development and investing in others. So I think cruciform leaders, whereas in other parts there's been a huge flash of, we know the amazing stories of the Welsh revival, but then Wales in the UK today is one of the more unchurched places. So I think God's Spirit sovereign work will happen at different times, but our part we play in it, we can't make it happen, but the part we play in it is then leading and stewarding well. So I think leadership at this moment is so utterly crucial for this to then become a genuine revival and for people to become Christians in large numbers and be Christian over a period of time versus it just being a vibe shift where all of a sudden people become interested in the church for a bit and then we're on to the next thing.
Is it fair to say, I totally resonate with your thoughts there around, it feels like something quite unique is happening in this particular move of the Spirit. And, because of that, there's a level of wisdom and discernment that's maybe more crucial than ever. That it's breaking the mold in some of the ways. So like a lot of the church world after 2,000 years, there's a lot of demystifying kind of terms or deconstructing some terms that have a particular provoke a particular mindset. So words like revival and awakening, we almost have to be careful, don't we, about what we mean when we say about that. And is there a link then almost to what we mean about leader really within that, so almost in the unique way that we're understanding what the Spirit is doing at the moment, there seems to be a unique way that leaders are going to lead through that. And ultimately it seems to me that the way of Jesus and the way of the apostles that followed in his footsteps seems to be something that we can go back to at least to find more inspiration in.
Well, I mean, I think about, there was a young woman who shared a story. We're encouraging people at this moment to just start asking, and guys were hosting one of the services, got up a young woman from our congregation, and she just talked about the story. She's sort of involved in theatre, and there was in this conversation where this person she's with, who she works in the theatre with, is like, oh, we had a pub quiz the other night, and there was a Bible question, and I didn't know the answer, and because we were told, don't read the Bible. So completely unchurched, no raising in anything. And then she's like, oh, I think I need to start reading the Bible. And then I think she invited to Alpha.
Wow.
That's new. So that's more like the first century than it is like the Welsh revival or the Hebridean revival or whatever. Because the apostles were starting with people who were, like from, particularly when they went outside of into the Gentile world, had no framework for these stories and were coming from Hellenic backgrounds or mystery religions or Roman or whatever. So, I think you're 100% right. How did they lead apostolically? And what can we learn from that? This time is a really interesting sort of question. And it's great because it sends us back to, the early church. And, back to scriptures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if there's somebody listening that is particularly maybe younger or emerging, and they feel like, I mean, one of the premises I take in the book is that in one level, it seems to me that the Bible indicates in one way we're all leaders because we all have influence, and in some ways it's less about leadership and more about stewardship. You know, what are you going to do with what you've been given? Seems to be more what Jesus' focus is on, and yet at the same time, it does seem to be distinct, the gift of leadership as well. And so in some ways I'm hoping that the Cruciform leader speaks to both, you know, speaks to those who never thought they were going to be the greatest leaders, but are actually leading well, and also those who have a natural God-given gift of leading or spiritual gift of leading, that they can too follow in the Cruciform way. What would you say to them in terms of how to steward that gift well?
Yeah. Jesus doesn't emerge until his 30s. And I think that part of, again, the platform mentality is that you've sort of just got to burst onto the scene and achieve all these things young. You know, there's a period of time, you know, like there's a guy who wrote a book, Bobby Clinton, who I met once, had pizza at his house. And he wrote a book called The Making of a Leader. And basically he studied the life of biblical leaders throughout history of the church, and even some political leaders. And effectively, God forms people over a lifetime. And I think we're very event-focused versus, or even role-focused. We're not process-focused. And so, you know, there is this element where you may feel like you've got to be doing it by 25 or whatever. You know, I have occasionally get the email of people like who will ask me like, oh, how do I do what you're doing, Mark? You've got this podcast, you've written this book, blah, blah, blah. And my journey, I know my first ministry thing is helping. I volunteered, didn't get paid, at a lunch for homeless people and people who lived in boarding houses. And, you know, I did stuff like that for years, you know, and I didn't do it because I wasn't like some mission guy who wants to do this stuff. I did stuff for a long time I did not want to do because God was more interested in shaping me than my gifts at that time. Obviously, looking back, you know, there were some gifts I had, but gifts without the shaping is key. So when I say, oh, don't stress, for years I'll be stressing like, oh, is it going to happen? Am I going to get to use my gifts? God will let you use your gifts at the right time. And so many things that have happened to me is just like divine appointments, God's sort of grace of just like this moment you meet this person, that happens, whatever. So I'd say don't panic. Allow yourself to be shaped. Often your late teens, 20s are setting down really good foundations, having lots of experiences that will grow you. And there'll be hurts and disappointments. Sometimes your friends won't come with you. And also it's also getting you beyond hype. I remember being at a thing when I was 17, 18, and there was a speaker from the UK, and there was this massive like altar call, and I was down the front, and there was this big like campground, and it was crying, and we're all there together, and we're all crying out for revival. And he sort of at the end just said, okay, what's going to happen is this. Some of you at some point are going to like, you're going to be like, we're going to be in this together. And then you look around at your mates and they'll start to be more interested in paying the bills and keeping their car clean. And, you know, mowing the lawn in the backyard. He's like, there's nothing wrong with that stuff, but this is going to happen. And will you keep going, passionately wanting God, when the rest of your friends sort of like zone out? So that's the other thing I would say, that it can be lonely. And it's not going to be en masse. And youth is an en masse thing. Often it's going to be a singular path. A cruciform, Jesus walks to the cross alone, you know? And there's some of the women watching on from a distance. The disciples are like Scar, but they're not, you know, they're not there. So, you know, that's a number of things. But I think at the end of the day, it is just continually saying yes to him. And I think many of the things that you've outlined in the chapters also come under the big heading of yes. You know, yes to surrender, yes to servanthood, yes to working with others, yes, even in the midst of testing, you know. So, yeah, that would be my advice.
It strikes me interesting as I was writing this book that sometimes we're trying to answer the wrong questions, or we're not listening to the right questions that Jesus wants to ask us. So, do you love me?
Yes, yes, yes.
To Peter, as opposed to how can I be successful?
Yes.
And then to James and John, it's when they ask about greatness sitting at his left and his right, it's can you drink this cup?
Yes.
Yes. And when it comes to the parable of the talents, it's what will you do with what you've been given?
Yes.
Sometimes I just think sitting with the questions of Jesus and meditating on them rather than what the world has told us success or career trajectory will look like or influence will look like.
Totally.
Will really will really hit us deep and cause deep formation.
Yes, totally. I mean, the thing I would say too is success will not feed your soul. I think Jesus is the only thing that, like Augustine said, our hearts are sort of constantly adrift until they find their home in him. And it's really interesting. Like, I've experienced some things in life which people would see as success in ministry. And it's so interesting. The moment after it happens, you realize it's not really a thing. I remember for years, like wanting to speak at this conference when I was younger because it was like right in my lane. And then 8 years later, I got invited to the conference and I spoke to thousands of people. And I walked off stage and I just thought, it just didn't feel anything. And then the next thing, you're packing your bag up and, so these people look for these things. But then I look back on the moments that have really touched my heart. It's the times with Jesus. It's his closeness, sometimes in moments of suffering. That's ultimately what we need to aim for.
Beautiful. Yeah. Maybe final thought is just, I was reflecting when you were saying one of the things I write about in the book is a particular time, probably in my mid-20s, where I just had an overwhelming sense of, I think somebody quite significant or senior had fallen. I can't remember who morally. And I knew at the time I was kind of striving for leadership because I could feel leadership a gift, but I was striving for getting to use it. And then at the same time, I heard this story, and I had this kind of almost can go back to the moment where it was like a fear of the Lord moment, where I said to the Lord, because I was feeling the grief and the pain of what this particular leader's fallenness had brought upon others. And I remember saying to the Lord, please don't give me something that you can't trust me with. And I almost remember when I prayed that prayer thinking, times I'm going to regret this because it's going to feel like others get to go in front or I'm going to be slower getting to that point. But it just felt like so weighty that, God, I'd rather wait than be given something that I can't handle. And I've really looked back at that moment and thank God for giving me the grace to pray that prayer, even though I've not been perfect in how I've outworked it. But because I think the reality is, you could maybe speak to this better than I could, obviously, but once it gets to the moment in some ways where it's like God is saying, okay, now's a moment, I'm opening some doors. It's intense, isn't it? It doesn't, it's, some days you'd like to go back to the moments where it doesn't feel as weighty or as costly. Because sometimes I say to some of our emerging leaders, I know you think that you're maybe not getting opportunity, but once you step in fully to where God is taking you to, you're going to be on a lot. If you're leading a church, you could be preaching not just twice a Sunday, but like 15 or 20 times a year. How are you going to prepare your heart for that? You're going to be dealing with pastoral problems. You're going to be thinking strategically. There's going to be all sorts of kind of pressures, isn't there? And so there's something about taking your time, really, that's so important.
Totally. Terry, who's on our team, who does worship, just was at a conference a few weeks ago in Sydney, and Darlene Check was there. And she just made this comment, which Terry relayed to me. And Darlene Check said, something of the words the effect of, one of the hardest things I ever had to do was pastor people through success.
Wow.
That's really interesting. Wow. And because success brings out things in us, and I've seen people who are like totally fine, great people, and then they get success and they change. And, it taps into our flesh, in really profound ways. The politician who's not corrupt, all of a sudden with money around gets corrupt. The person who, moral failure, it's easy to say like moral failure, but all of a sudden you're in a position of power and people are looking to you and attracted to you in these particular ways. Most people don't have that experience, and so, I have a friend who will often say, better people than you and I will fall. And I was like, oh, that's a humbling thing, because you can look at that, not me. So, there's a sense where I think that, responsibility is a massive thing, and where God asks you to be responsible for certain things, it is a death to self. It doesn't feed you in a way that you expect. And I think that's really key. So the Lord will generate that in us, because he's asking, can he trust us? So they think, can he trust us? And what I found, just one thing that's interesting is so many different things which would be seen as worldly success or Christian versions of success, often God will give it to you and then you have to hand it back in a way. You have to put it back on the altar. I'm a big believer, my dad taught me that, he'd always say, if you put it on the altar, a job, something you possessed, a relationship, if you put it on the altar. And, I've always carried that. And so, like, even when you get this stuff, it's constantly, would I be prepared to walk away? Wow. And there's some people who are not, and if God told me to walk away, easier said than done. But I think when you can't walk away, that's when the flesh gets a hook. That's when an idol is formed, and
I'm just thinking, maybe to finish these words from Thomas Keating, I think fit quite well with what you said. The spiritual journey is not a career or a success story. It is a series of humiliations of the false self that become more and more profound. These make room inside us for the Holy Spirit to come in and heal.
Wow. That's good. Oh my goodness.
May the Lord give us grace.
Oh yeah. Amen.
Thank you, Mark, for your time. Really
Pleasure.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.